I would describe it as being in the abyss. I mean, I use this word a lot, but about what it's like to be in an abyss in which you have seen something that is so big that you can't fathom how to make sense of it, but somehow you do. And I think that's what I make the work about, is to translate some of that so that other people maybe can make sense of that for themselves.
Welcome to Subtext and Discourse Art World Podcast, where we highlight the unique perspectives on contemporary art and photography. I'm your host, Michael Dooney. My guest today is Jessa Fairbrother, a British visual artist whose work spans stitch, photography, performance, and drawing. Describing herself as a motherless, childless artist using body as material, we talk about the difficult path she's navigated on the road to becoming an artist and the ways grief and loss have informed her practice. This was a heavy interview and touches on a number of emotional topics, so I'm grateful to Jessa for being so open with her experiences and sharing them in this context. A quick reminder to please subscribe to Subtext and Discourse Art World Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. It helps to grow the show and enables others to learn about my guests. Now, without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Jessa Fairbrother. When we spoke a few months ago, there was additional backstory, which I wasn't aware of just by seeing your work, which I think we should probably cover here as well. And I'll lead into that by saying that you didn't initially intend to be an artist. Somehow life encouraged you to be an artist, even if initially you were resistant to it.
I mean, the thing about not intending to be an artist is that my parents were artists and I tried not to be because I felt like I didn't want to do what they were doing. You know, I'd grown up with parents who were artists, and that is a certain way of being. You know, I felt that I wanted to have something that wasn't like that, I suppose. But weirdly, every time I kind of tried to do something that was maybe a bit more not like an artist, I found it difficult to fit in because that way of being is adjacent to a sort of, I'm sort of really sort of staggering around it because I'm trying to sort of paint a picture of it. It's just my experience, not, you know.
Did they encourage you to be an artist when you were growing up?
They wanted me to do whatever I wanted to do. I think that was the really interesting thing. I suppose they would have supported me doing whatever I wanted to do. And what I thought I wanted to do was be an actor. So I tried to do that.
Yeah.
I tried to sort of avoid being an artist by being an actor. It's a really terrible choice in terms of sort of stability. But I suppose that was my artistic expression. And that was where I put my energy. What I actually thought, I remember going to university to do English. I was really into lots of things as a teenager. I liked making my own clothes. I loved making my own clothes. And I loved being in school plays. And I thought, oh, well, I can actually do all these things as well. So I will go and do English because that's sensible. And then I can keep those things going. And then at least I've done the sensible thing, got an English degree, and that's kind of practical. I don't know why I thought practical, but, you know, that was what I thought. And I wanted to go to drama school.
But for acting, as in like on the stage or for TV?
I really wanted to do very, very serious theatre. And,
oh, wow, okay.
Maybe I thought I had the most naive sort of idea that, you know, I remember walking with some friends along the South Bank in London and talking about just doing profit share and maybe an advert to support this image of being very serious actor and doing profit share.
I guess that obviously didn't happen. You didn't go down that. You didn't go down that route. So what changed for you? What did you? I guess you finished the studies, or you?
I did. I went to drama school after university. You know, I took out a career development loan. Went to drama school. I was trying to do it, and it was really hard. It was just quite a difficult experience. I was living in London, and I was working as a dresser. So a dresser in theatre is somebody who works in the wardrobe department. And they are the people that sort of do the costume changes with the actors backstage and do the laundry. So you help people do quick changes, something that happens literally in the wings, and you do the laundry. So you take the socks and underwear down at the beginning of the performance, and then you collect it at the end, do the ironing, and you collect all the costumes and you rehang the costumes. And a lot of people who do those roles are often writers or actors that try to keep their days free to go to auditions or whatever it is that they're endeavouring to do. So you have this sort of evening job and matinees that theoretically leave your days free to go to auditions. I did it for a while, and then essentially it sort of got cut short by the discovery that my father was very ill and he was diagnosed with cancer. So I've missed out a chapter. I'd already kind of given that up. I'd got a job in a literary agency. I remember that.
Were you still in London when you were working?
I was still in London, yeah. I was still in London, and I got a job as a receptionist in a really nice agency that looked after directors and producers and writers. And then I found out that my dad was terminally ill. So I left London and I just sort of walked out, really, very abruptly.
Yeah. And how old were you?
25.
Gosh.
And my mum and dad at the time, they were living in West Wales. And this was before, there was internet, but it was that dial-up where you heard the funny noise. And so there was internet, but there was no, it was pre-Facebook and all those things. I left London and that was it. I left everyone I knew. I just walked out of my life and went home, and I had to get a job. I had a degree in English, so I got a job on a local paper, and I was a reporter. And I spent that time while my dad was dying at home with a job on a local paper.
Were you there as a carer, or were you there, I suppose you've had some unexpected, horrible kind of life experiences, like I have to go close to my parents now because this is it, like I won't.
It was sort of like I was there and I was part of that. But, my mum was alive, so she was the carer, but I was there. And it was about a year, just over a year before he died, maybe 15 months, something like that.
Yeah.
And he was young. He was 54 when he died. Quite young. Oh, gosh. And it was really hard. It was hard. And I remember it quite vividly as it sort of derailed us all. And that experience was very formative. And I think about it, I sort of at 25, I felt like an adult, but I don't in reality look back and think of myself as an adult at that time. When I was 25, you just feel like you know so much. You think, oh, I've done loads, I've done this, I've done that. But actually, I just felt like looking back as a kid.
Yeah. And I think having that experience that young as well, it can't not derail you because you're sort of facing your parents' mortality at a really early age. I suppose that experience really, I don't know, brings you back down to earth is the right expression, but it really pushes you to put other things into perspective and you look at things a lot differently, I think, when something like that happens. Were you close with your family before?
I was. I mean, it was just horrible. And I didn't know anyone else that it had happened to. And that's something that even now I look back and I think, well, my friends around me now, loads of them still have both their parents.
Yeah.
And I find that just so sort of, bizarre that, both mine are dead. And it's something that, again, because there was no structure around me that reflected what I was experiencing, and there was no social media. So there was nothing to confirm or deny what I was in, if you see what I mean. There was no representation of it around me. And there was no way of me looking to somebody else for an experience that was like mine. And it was already odd, it was already unusual. They were both artists. They'd lived an unusual life. They already had unusual lives. So there was this thing that was happening to me, really it was happening to all of us, but there was my experience in an experience that was already unusual. And yet I didn't have any way of making sense of that. But what that did was I did go through that seize the day kind of moment. And what I had been trying to do up until that point, which was be an actor, was completely brought to an end. And I had thought, just before my dad was diagnosed, I had been thinking, what am I going to do, because I'm not going to be an actor? This isn't working out. And I had just been thinking about going and doing some courses at the City Lit in photography, because I was just sort of thinking about that. And then my dad died, and he'd been a photographer. He'd been a graphic designer, is how he'd made his sort of bread and butter. So I was thinking maybe I should do that. And it was really obvious. It was sort of like that reaction to him dying and being a photographer. And I thought, well, I'm going to go and do that. So that experience was the catalyst to something that I'd already been thinking about. But it was just, how it came about was this sort of very abrupt event that led to that.
Yeah. So you studied photography, or you started doing it at this, where did you say you went? Or
Well, so this was, when was this? 2001. There was a college in the first really big town in West Wales. And I went there and I did an HND. And I had this experience on a paper. And I had thought, my dad had been a photographer, and he had all these books that I had been really familiar with. And they were all the sort of classic books. They were Delka's book, Gypsies, and Philip James Griffiths, Vietnaming. And, those books were on our shelves. And, they were all essentially the book about the hero's journey. And I had found them, obviously they were the books that I saw, along with actually Penny Slinger's The Exorcism, which I found really, really disconcerting, and I didn't understand it at all. And now is actually such an important book to me. But the books that I felt I understood at the time were those books that were very sort of key photojournalist texts that we all knew. And so I thought at the time that was what I wanted to do, because I'd been working on a paper. And I thought I wanted to tell stories that fitted into those structures of telling.
Yeah.
I very quickly realised it was not. That's what I thought. Very quickly realised.
Because which was the first one that you did? Was it the wedding dress one or the park benches? Like there's a few different...
Yeah. So after my dad died, where I lived, which was West Wales, there is a huge number of memorial benches, because it's a national park, and a lot of memorial benches are located at viewing points along the coast, and they all have these memorial plaques on them. And I was really interested in the fact that there were these plaques in these public places that were about putting someone in a landscape that said this person was here, they existed, and they meant something to somebody. And I thought, I'm going to photograph all these plaques, and I'm going to sit on the bench and photograph the view from the bench, and I'm going to put them together, and then I'm going to put text underneath about the person that the plaque is dedicated to. And because I'd worked on this paper, I thought, well, I'm going to be able to trace people who've put these benches there. And I did, by and large. And I got some funding. I got a small pot of money from the Arts Council, and I did do that. And I made this body of work about these memorial benches. And it's funny because I thought that I wasn't making it about myself. But of course it was. It was about my loss of my father. But I thought I was doing something about someone else.
When did you realise that?
I knew quite quick. Maybe, I don't know when I really was able to articulate that. But just not when I was in my 20s. But I had these two ideas. I thought, one idea I had was I'm going to walk from one end of the Pembrokeshire Coast Pass to the other, and I'm going to do it as a sort of meditation. I'm going to take a tent and I'm going to camp. I'm going to do it in one go, and it's going to be this walking thing. And of course, that's probably what I should have done. But I thought, no, that's about me. I won't do that. And then I'm going to do it this other way. I actually think that would have been a much more interesting experience to have done the meditative walk, and probably much more aligned with how I feel about making work. But again, it was this thing of avoiding. What was I avoiding? I was avoiding talking about myself in relation to what had happened to me. And I was avoiding making work that really went there, because I was 26, 27. I didn't have the tools. I didn't have the understanding of myself in order to make that work. So I said, it's about other people. And I'm going to go and find the stories of other people, because there's a framework for that. And the very first one I remember doing, a very early one, And it was really important. I went to see somebody whose wife had died, and I went into the house, and all I could feel was the hole where she had been. That's just really hit me, this feeling of somebody else's loss. And it was very overwhelming feeling. I was really conscious of it. And it happened, a few times I spoke to people on the phone who'd had really, really sad things happen to their family. And I found it, again, I didn't have the sort of emotional literacy or language skills to kind of really articulate what that was. So I just kind of transcribed their story and used that with the images that I had made. And they were, looking out to sea. It was this sort of, now I think about it, it's sort of really, it was obvious why I did that. Sitting on a bench looking out to sea, you're looking at the horizon, you're looking at actually just, this expanse, trying to locate why it is that you're feeling just huge sense of loss. But the gesture of each person has been that they've put their marker in the landscape, that person existed. And actually I can feel that's what it was about, because I'm getting emotional talking about it. I can feel the impulse to say someone was here and they meant something. And that's why they put a plaque on a bench in public to say they meant something and they were loved. And here's a place that I want people to see that they meant something. That's the thing that really got me about why people do these things, why I do this thing, is because we want to say, well, it meant something that I was here. I couldn't possibly have understood that at 27.
No.
I sort of did, but I just didn't have the language. So that was that project, and I called it An Important You. And I put it in the libraries near where those benches were located. So the benches that were in South Pembrokeshire went to the library that was in South Pembrokeshire. And the benches that were in Mid Pembrokeshire went to the library that was near us. I wanted to put it in this space where anyone could access it. So that was the thing that I did immediately after my father died. That was the sort of first body of work that I made. But, it sort of felt like I was utilising where I was as a way of making stories about other people. I still didn't understand that was my path. I was avoiding it again. A lot of avoidances.
How did you... and that's a normal thing. I think a lot of, not just artists, but I think people, we do that. We avoid the things sometimes that maybe we know that we should do something or that we want to do something, but then we think about, I guess, what our perceived role is or what we should do. So you'd made the project about your father and you were on a new path. You were becoming a photographer, working at the paper must have been going okay.
I'd left that. I think I'd left that and I actually did some work on radio and then we moved.
Oh, okay.
So then what happened was that we relocated, me and my partner, now my husband. We were in the Midlands, and actually this is where I made the work that you actually mentioned earlier about women who kept their wedding dresses. Because I'd started working on a couple of newspapers, again as a photographer, and trying to do it as a jobbing photographer. And again, I just knew that wasn't really how I was telling stories or how I wanted to tell stories. I thought, I think I need to do an MA. I think that's probably something important. I want to think about how many years later, maybe 5. And I didn't think I had the work to get onto an MA.
Oh, okay.
I didn't think I had the right sort of work. I didn't know what I was sort of doing in that way. I didn't think I had the right sort of work.
But what inspired you then to do the MA? Like you felt like you'd got to a point with your photographic output, like you'd hit a wall almost, like you couldn't go any further, and you thought, I need that to get to where I want to go?
I felt that I was at a crossroads and that I either was going to... It was about storytelling and how I wanted to tell stories. And I didn't enjoy the experience of being a photographer on a regional paper. I knew that wasn't me, sort of parachuting in and sort of getting a photograph that told a story in a certain way. I didn't like it. I felt that there was this power imbalance that I really didn't like. There was some really amazing, very good newspaper photographers around me. I could just see they were doing something different, that they were working in a way that I didn't enjoy. I think I just sort of felt unfinished. I think I had this feeling. I knew that because I hadn't hadn't sort of studied photography in depth. I felt unfinished. And, you know, I read British Journal of Photography and I'd sort of read it and think there's something else here that I don't think I'm doing, that I wanted to do. At this point, I actually was working as again, some wilderness years, lots of insecure, you know, jobs and temping. And I'd ended up, there was actually an opportunity to train there were bursaries to train in teaching, to train in further education. It was just a no-brainer because it listed everything that I could do. It had photography, it had media studies, it had English. And I thought this is an absolute no-brainer to do this qualification. So I did. I got a teaching qualification. And I realised that this thing about storytelling was really important. I didn't feel I had the work to do MMA. And I had been thinking for some reason about, I must have read I think I remember reading an advert. It was an advert for an event at the museum in Sheffield for women who had kept their wedding dresses to archivally pack them properly. It was just a little advert. Do you want to learn how to archivally wrap your wedding dress?
Oh, okay.
And I thought, that sounds really interesting. I'll go to that. I might meet some women who've kept their dresses all their lives, and I would like to meet them. I don't know what possessed me, but I did. I went to meet. I just went because I thought that sounded interesting. There were a couple of women there. I said, "Can I photograph you with your wedding dress?" And that became a body of work called I Did. And it was about women who kept their wedding dresses for a really long time. I didn't specify how long, but just over 10 years. But, you know, that idea that women who kept their wedding dress, they had this idea that they thought they would pass it on. Then there's this realization that a wedding dress dates really badly. As in, it dates. It's a really strange marker of time.
Oh, you mean like from a fashion perspective?
The fashion and the fabric. It's not something that, it's not an elastic, flexible item. It really, really speaks to the time that it was made.
Ah, okay, yeah.
It's incredible. It's an incredible object. And it points forward and back because when women who kept a wedding dress that they've had for decades, when they take it out and they hold it against their body, it's the most extraordinary portal. Because what you can see is they're holding their dress against their body, the older body holding the younger body against themselves. And I knew that was really what I wanted to make work about. This thing of the body looking forward and back was an incredible thing. It reminded me of so many things. When I was at university, I directed a production of My Mother Said I Never Should, which is a play by Charlotte Keatley. At the time, it was a text for GCSE English in the UK, which is about 4 generations of women who are all related, and it's about secrets. And it's older women playing all ages of themselves. And so you can read it as essentially it's the older woman playing the younger woman. And I did it at university in a really sort of awkward way because we were all young. And so all the younger women were playing older women. I thought that was fine. It was actually, it did work sort of. But the point of the story is that it's older women playing themselves as younger women. And so this idea has always, since I was a teenager, I have found fascinating about the older woman looking at the younger woman and the younger woman looking at the older woman. And so when I got to the wedding dress thing, you're taking out this incredibly dated item. It might be from 1975 and it's made in crimply. That fabric doesn't even exist anymore as it's not made. And seeing somebody hold it against themselves, it's not nostalgia. Obviously, there's elements of nostalgia, but it's much more than that because it's a thing about looking at the self and unrealized dreams. Because I made this body of work and I didn't write down the stories of those women. Yeah. You know, whereas with the benches, I wrote down the stories of all the things that had happened to those people and always finished with how old they were when they died and what they died from. I realized when I made the project, I did not want to anchor that down because then it became about the story of the thing that had happened to them. And I thought it was far more meaningful if that story was not attached to the image. So the name is there, but you don't know if they're widowed or divorced was still married.
Yeah.
And that felt really important to me because it was about something bigger than the picture of the person. It was about the shape of them with the dress and what that opened up for the viewer to encounter with what might have been. And I think that was such an important body of work for me because it opened up this idea about what might have happened and how we try and read into a very recognisable object with the wedding dress, and we try and build a story around an expected happy ending of a narrative, conventional, like a very sort of, within a certain structure.
Yeah, or even the societal ceremony and ritual around that and what it signifies.
It's such a strong, it's like I use this word portal because it is a portal to so many thoughts about yourself and society and symbols.
So when you finished the wedding dress project, and I guess you must have got accepted to do the MA with this body of work?
I used that as a sort of my portfolio.
How was it received actually when you applied? Like, did you get feedback and stuff like that? Because this would have been the first time showing work in in that context, wouldn't it?
It's really funny. I don't remember the actual interview per se, but I had a portfolio review before I went with a photographer who's head of photography at Bath Spa called Stephen Vaughan. He had a solo show at the time at Impressions Gallery in Bradford, which is a really well-known sort of photographic gallery. And him and the director, Anne McNeil, gave me my first portfolio review. I think it might have been my second portfolio review ever, or maybe my first ever. Can't quite remember. And they were really, really positive about it. So I felt like I was onto something, and I remember I remember it really vividly. And also I remember Impressions being, at the time, you could pay £10, you could write a cheque, and if you turned up to your review, you got the cheque back, which was so nice.
Yeah.
It sounds like something so old-fashioned, but it was so meaningful. I remember sort of turning up, and I think I'd bought a proper box and proper portfolio, all the kind of thing, that you don't actually do anymore in PDF. But they were Cibachromes. I'd shot them on. I'd shot them on transparency. It's like a big white dress with no lighting. It's just such a terrible thing to do. But yeah, I made this. It was really, really lovely experience actually, and I'm still in touch with Stephen. Is really sort of very much part of my world, and I still remember that portfolio review. It was amazing. But I did get accepted, and I did go to Westminster, and that was amazing. And that was the moment where it did change for me, because I'd done this body of work, and then I started the MA, and they'd set various sort of topics and projects and things, and I'd done things that we'd sort of been set.
Yeah.
Tried very hard. I really liked being a student. I like being a student. I like trying, doing really well. I'm sort of quite driven by doing really well at school, that kind of thing. So I tried all that. And then I was I thought for my final major project, I had this idea that I'd photographed women who'd kept their wedding dresses for a really long time. And I thought, what happens if I do something about women that haven't got married? And this is actually such an important part of my thinking, because I wanted to make something about people who hadn't got married, women who hadn't got married. There's a word that is attached to that, spinster, and it provokes such sort of heckles in people, like the heckles come up, and it's sort of used in a really pejorative way. And I had found it sort of something very difficult to get my head around. How did I photograph women that hadn't got married? How did I make work about something that hadn't happened? And in the UK, the most famous woman who hadn't got married was former Conservative MP Anne Widdecombe. She was quite well known for sort of being labelled as a spinster. And I wrote her, I said, would she be in my project? And she said yes. And then I never did it. I actually never went to meet Anne Widdecombe, but I do have the letters somewhere that she agreed. But I never did it. But I was trying very hard, and I was sort of photographing. I can't really remember what I tried, but it just didn't work. And I was talking about it in a tutorial one day, and I was talking about this dress that I had. And it was a dress that a boyfriend had given me when I was about 20 that I found quite unsettling because it looked a bit wedding-y. It was white and it was sort of a cocktail dress and it didn't suit me and I didn't really feel like it was me. And I was talking about it in a tutorial for some reason. And someone in my group said, oh, why don't you put it on? And I thought, oh, that's a good idea. So I did. And then I photographed myself in this dress. And that was it. That was the moment. That was the sort of, that kind of critical thing that happened. And I photographed myself in this dress. And I looked at it and I thought, I'm onto something now. And so I photographed myself in this dress and I made a very small body of work, which became the thing that I did for my MA. And so that was how I ended up photographing myself. And I called it Subtitled. And it was about fiction and film and about performing the happy ending and yearning for the happy ending. And so it sort of became this negotiation of all the things I consumed as a teenager and all those Victorian novels that I'd read and all those films that I found really seductive and appealing. And they looked really nice. You know, they sort of had that beautiful look. And it was a sort of negotiation about all that consumption, but using myself. And I didn't have to be in dialogue with a sort of power dynamic of photographing someone else, which I found really uncomfortable. I'd been able to remove that. I was photographing myself as the older body in the thing that represented the younger body. And I was in dialogue with all those things that I'd been sort of avoiding. And I made a very small body of work about it, but it was completely transformative. And that was what got me, I finished the MA, and that was when I felt I had found something that was really interesting, really relevant to what I was trying to say. And I was just getting going on that. And then I'd found at the end of my MA, I'd found the pictures of the Salpêtrière archive. And they are photographs of women in a 19th century hospital in Paris, in the 19th century. And they were photographed in states of illness, mental illness. And just as I was discovering them, I started to make work about them.
About the people in the pictures, or?
Yeah, I thought that was something I was interested in. I read a book called The Invention of Hysteria, and it was really interesting to me. My grandmother, who was French and had suffered with manic depression, had been a very sort of significant figure in my childhood. And I was in dialogue with these photographs and in dialogue with the recollections I had of my grandmother and performing. And so I was in dialogue with this work, thinking about my grandmother, thinking about all these things, thinking about performance. Just as I was sort of getting going, my mother died.
I mean, that's really hard.
Yeah.
Especially that you've already kind of got derailed, like with your dad, and then you kind of finally get some momentum, and then you lose another parent kind of earlier than you would expect. Yeah,
that was really brutal. Really brutal. I avoided saying brutal at the beginning about my dad, but I think it was really brutal with my mum.
Yeah. Were you closer to your mum than your dad?
Yeah. I mean, I was close to both of them, but I had that sort of much more nuanced, complex, close relationship with my mum. Again, it was quite a similar scenario in that I was doing a thing. I was in Sheffield at the time, and I had a studio and I was making this work, and it had just been shown in a really good group show in Manchester. I'd made the work, which was called The Rehearsal, dedicated to Augustine. Augustine was a very significant figure in these photographs, the archive of Salpêtrière. And I called it The Rehearsal because it was about, again, this theatre, this relationship to performance. And I'd made this work that was about me performing in a red dress, and I put it in a carousel, an analogue carousel of the projector. And I was so pleased to be showing it, and I was sort of just finding my way. I had a studio. I hadn't had a studio before, and I was in a community of artists. And they were all kind of very different artists to me. They were making lots more installation and sculpture and video. It was a community of artists cross discipline, and I was just sort of in my life, And then I got a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember it really vividly. I was at the studio, And my mum had found out that she had this shadow. And I said, I'm coming. And I got in the car and I drove to Bristol, and that was it. And I literally just walked out of my life again.
Like, looking back now, do you think you approached it differently the second time, or it was the same kind of punch in the guts? I don't know what to do.
I think it was the same punch in the guts. And I think I felt I couldn't not do it. I felt like I'd done it for my dad. I had to, nowhere else and couldn't do it for my mum. And, so many reasons, I just never would have not done it. It's too many negatives to know. I just had to do it. She was on her own. I've got a brother. My brother was here. But what I mean is that her partner had died.
Yeah.
And so, she didn't have someone in the house. And that's brutal to go through. And it was really quick with my mum. It was only 9 months. It was only 9 months. So the process of being in close proximity of somebody who's dying, it's just really, really sad.
Yeah. I guess from the outside, looking at the experience, this time you were documenting your mother. At least, I don't know if you documented your dad when he was kind of in his last stages, but you were like making work with your mum as she was going through her final stages.
I did photograph my dad, actually, at the end. And I have a very small set of photographs that were black and white, documenting, and they're too awful. Like, they're really painful. And I look at them because they are him actually very unwell. He was pleased I was taking photographs.
Yeah.
There was this kind of different relationship, as in he was much more maybe pleased that I was taking his photographs. Because he actually took photographs of himself when he had surgery. I remember going to see him in Birmingham. He had to go, it's quite a long way. He had to go a really long way to get this particular surgery. And I remember him photographing. He asked me to photograph this massive scar. So there was much more of a close relationship with taking photographs of what happened to him. With my mum, I didn't really want to, because I sort of felt like there was a hesitancy on my part that she wasn't going to want to be remembered in that way. Okay. So I did make pictures of her, but not many. And I asked her to make pictures of me as a sort of foil, in a way, like a structure that we could have together. And we'd done that already with a disposable camera, maybe a year before, 6 months before. I had suggested we make some work somehow on a disposable camera. So I took a photograph in Sheffield and posted it to her. She took a photograph in Bristol and posted it back.
Oh, yeah.
So I had this structure already. So I said, why don't you take a photograph of me and I'll take a photograph of you? And so I had this very small collection of photographs, and I photographed her in the garden. But I didn't really enjoy the idea of photographing her with the intent to share them. Yeah. As in, I didn't want to photograph her looking like she was ill. I thought that would be really mean.
Yeah.
For me, that would have been transgressive, I think, and unnecessary. Even though I've seen other people, obviously, I've seen lots of work where people have photographed somebody close to them ill. It just felt like I couldn't do it. I think she was very beautiful, and I didn't want people to see her like that.
Yeah.
I thought that was private.
So I can see from your dad's perspective, him being a photographer throughout his life, and then in his last moments, seeing his daughter photographing, that would have been a sweet experience for him, and probably for you as well, to see him appreciating that and enjoying that. Like, that would have been a nice, I think, memory to hang on to. Do you think as well, because both of your parents are artists and you are now an artist yourself, that even starting with the disposable camera project with your mum, not knowing what was going to happen, and then getting her to photograph you when you were looking after her, was that a way of also for the two of you to maybe interact without directly addressing what was happening? Because sometimes there aren't words for things, and it's like, how do you speak about these experiences which are so hard to talk about and to deal with and to face up to, and maybe through the creative act, like through making work together, like was that a way of maybe processing what was happening?
I'm sure it was. I don't ever remember talking directly to her about it. It wasn't like we sat down and had a quick analyse the photographs that came out.
No, exactly. Like it was like maybe this was something that you did with your parents throughout your lives. Like you made art together, and that was like a thing that you did.
I think that's more likely. I think that's exactly it. Yeah, and there were a couple of things I remember sharing. One was when we were in the hospital. When I was in the hospital with my mum, I drew a picture of her. I drew a portrait of her sort of lying on the bed. And I remember showing it to her and her saying, that's quite good. That's sort of, that's quite good, actually. And then I remember taking the photographs that I'd made. And this was a moment where I got some very cheap prints back. And I thought I was going to do something with them. And one of the things that my mum had been a painter and a printmaker, really. And she'd kind of done a lot of, she liked sort of intervening on the surface of things. She had done the last sort of year or so. I remember looking at her doing a lot of stuff to the surface of things. And I got these prints back, and I remember putting them in a wheelbarrow full of water and just leaving them outside. And I remember her saying to me, it was a bit strange seeing my face like in the wheelbarrow. But that was like sort of, I suppose what you picked up on is that it was just what we did. There wasn't any kind of discussion. It was just, we made stuff, we drew stuff, there was stuff, there were books, and we read books about stuff, and then we made art about stuff.
Yeah.
So there's nothing like, so that's the thing about, that's what it was like. So what is there to discuss?
Yeah.
You're just making stuff.
Yeah. And maybe for other people that don't make things, it's probably hard to understand, but I suppose I've grown up around that as well. Like my mum sews and she has always made things, and my wife is the same. Like she can't just sit in front of a television. She has to have a knitting or be making something or doing something. And like that impulse maybe, or that kind of need to do things with your hands and to create, for some people that's just an innate part of who they are. And I guess that was your unit really. That was how your family interacted.
I think that's true. I think they were always making stuff, both my parents, and we were always all making stuff, be it jam or quilts or art, or they went through a soap phase. I don't know why people can make soap, or I mean they kind of had sort of slightly eccentric ideas about that. They'd have schemes that they think of doing, and get home and there was this bit where they rescued 2 Vietnamese pot-bellied pigs. I don't know what that was about. They did, these things kind of happened, and there were these things like but they were incredibly practical, like but doing things that were slightly maybe they were unusual. But then what is usual? It was normal to me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if that was your normal. So
yeah, yeah. So no, putting a print in a wheelbarrow and leaving it for a few days, perfectly fine.
Because I think that's modifying the prints, like that became a big part of how your process is now. You're working with photography. I suppose the other big, like, emotional blow that happened at this time, did you talk about that with your mother as well? Or did you find out before, at the same time? Like, what else kind of fit in with this? Because I think one of the things that you describe yourself as on your website is a motherless, childless artist. I mean, this is the childless piece of the equation now.
I did talk about it with my mother. I didn't get the opportunity to talk about it with her huge amount. So around this time, that was when I discovered that my fertility was unraveling. That's why I think this was exceptionally brutal, was because what was happening was I was losing my mother, and I was losing the story of me becoming a mother in the sense of a birthing body. That was not going to happen for me. So the process of sort of discovering that was literally the same time as my mother dying and then me grieving. And so I did have the opportunity to talk about it a little bit with my mum, because I'd had one miscarriage before she was diagnosed.
Okay.
And I had a very early miscarriage when she was being diagnosed. And then afterwards as well. But I do remember I got to talk about it with her a bit. But the thing was that it coincided with her diagnosis. So that kind of subsumed that part of the story because she was dying. And so I just thought, I'll deal with this later. Because what can I do? She's dying now. And so how awful would it have been to have made it about me at that point when she was dying? And I wanted her, I suppose, to think that I was going to have children.
Yeah.
At least that she could imagine. So I didn't talk about it with her too much because it was just an all-consuming experience of her dying. And I remember talking about it with this psychoanalyst who I'd met at the Freud Museum. I was doing a performance with the text to what became the body of work that I made out of this. So I made Conversations with My Mother, and I wrote a text, and I did it as a sort of spoken word performance at the Freud Museum for a conference they did on mourning and melancholia. And there was this psychoanalyst that I met who does a lot of work with women. And I remember her saying, you gave birth to the death of your mother, because it was 9 months. It was like,
oh, really?
I found out. And the significance of that, it's just such an extraordinary observation. I find that so incredibly resonant. And it's sort of only been as I have been able to sort of stand in my own space and in my own power and in my own confidence that I can sort of say that and now kind of talk about it, live it, be it, share a work about it. I wouldn't have been able to do that kind of excavation when I was 25.
No way. But even just to go through that, to have both of those significant losses parallel, the fact that you could still put aside, your infertility struggle to care for your mother in her last months.
I would describe it as being in the abyss. I mean, I use this word a lot, but about what it's like to be in an abyss in which you have seen something that is so big that you can't fathom how to make sense of it, but somehow you do. And I think that's what I make the work about, is to translate some of that so that other people maybe can make sense of that for themselves. And I realized that to say I'm a motherless, childless artist as part of the way I describe myself was a straightforward entry point for somebody to make sense of what it is that I'm making work about, because it's so much part of what I'm making work about. To be in dialogue with a maternal line that is not in materiality there, but takes up so much psychic space. And that is a recognizable experience, so that I can make sense of that for the people.
Yeah. So with the symposium then, you mentioned that there were other women sharing their stories from like 40 years ago, 30 years ago, and it was still as present as though it had happened yesterday.
Yeah.
Like having that kind of shared space. Did it feel also like for a lot of those women, because I know that when Eleanor Broderes spoke about her work, that was the first time that she had spoken about the project. That was a 10-year-old project, and that was the first time that she'd spoken publicly about it. Did you get the sense that for a lot of other women that were talking about their work, and people in the audience that were sharing their stories as well, that it was the first time that as a collective you had a space that you could share these stories of loss and grief in a supportive environment where like everybody understood what it was like?
Yeah, it was. It was. I probably should explain. The symposium was one of the events that has been around the exhibition Acts of Creation on Art and Motherhood, which includes the work that I made adjacent to Conversations with My Mother. So in it, there's a piece which is called Role Play Woman with Cushion, and it's me performing being a mother with a cushion at my dress. I actually made that work in response to photographs that I found just after my mother died of my mother pregnant with me that were taken by my father. And the staging of the work, which are photographs stitched into a quilt, depicts me in sort of various stages of a pregnancy that is a performance. That's the work that's in Acts of Creation. And then I was invited to speak about, my work in the symposium. And I think that the symposium and the exhibition, which is a really, expanded use of the term motherhood, it's about anybody that has ever been in relation to mothering, which is all of us. It's not just about women who have had children, but it's an expanded term. And to be in that show, to be in the symposium, has been transformative because it has been about connecting me to a dialogue, connecting me to other stories, and connecting me to other artists, where I have ceased to feel that loneliness that I felt as an artist, making that work. And the symposium, I'd say, absolutely opened a door to me feeling much less lonely about the story, because there were so many stories in the room.
Yeah.
Everyone had an unbelievable story. And I felt really humbled by the amount of stories that were shared in that room. And it just sort of felt like, if I was sort of visualizing it, it was sort of like, I kind of sometimes feel like I'm a scribble on a page. I just feel like it's like if you just scribble, that's kind of how I'm feeling. It's like, this scribbling. And I just felt like there were these kind of tangles. If you could have visualized this auditorium, there were just so many tangles above people's heads of all these kind of stories that were just sort of in the room, like meandering together. It was extraordinary. And it was such an incredible thing to be part of, to witness and be part of, and really humbling to hear them. And every time someone did a presentation element, and then there would be the opportunity to ask questions. But I think there was maybe one question. Everyone just wanted to speak, so people from the audience would tell their story. And it was such a moving thing to be part of. And yes, Alina Brother has spoke about her work that she's not spoken about in public before. And it was just so moving. It was so incredibly moving to witness. It was like we were all witnessing each other. And it was amazing. It has been amazing to be in that show, because it creates a sort of psychological safety and an environment in which those things can be talked about. You really need the right environment for those things to come forth.
Yeah.
And I think that's what, the curator, that's what Hettie Judah has done, is that she's created this space for these stories to be stewarded into the world in dialogue with each other. And it's made a thing bigger than the sum of its parts.
The symposia only happened recently, so maybe there isn't enough expanse of time to look back on it. But do you think being part of that experience helped validate a lot of things for you?
Yes, I think it did validate a lot of things. It's sort of all the things I couldn't quite put my finger on before, or I dismissed, this feeling of being alone, or a feeling of it not being visible. I tried to sort of discount it, but that being in this has validated what I felt was real, because it's the mental gymnastics of making work about a thing that didn't happen. So to come back to this thing of storytelling and happy endings and narratives that we can understand, if we sort of think of the classical kind of way of telling a story in a three-part structure, beginning, middle, and an end, we're talking about child loss or children not being born. There's a thing that didn't happen. And I'm using a tool in my practice is a camera, which is about a thing that was in the world. So there are so many things that didn't happen, and I'm using a tool which is connected to a thing that did happen, and I'm using it the same, what I said at the beginning about women who didn't get married. The mental gymnastics that you have to do in order to explain a story about a thing that doesn't have a happy ending. It is so hard to communicate in a convention where we desire collectively a conclusion. And what I'm talking about is the fact that that doesn't come, that we are in the abyss. And that is an expansive experience and actually doesn't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. I mean, we're alive and we die. There is a conclusion to our lives, and that is the uniting factor. But in storytelling, we look for patterns of storytelling that we understand. And, you know, a huge amount of Western literature is dominated by, for example, the Victorian novel, even though we've got other forms of storytelling. You know, it's like a conventional structure with a beginning, middle, and an end. And stories actually so much about child loss and infertility. If you open a newspaper and there's a feature and it's about infertility, the last paragraph would always be the baby.
Yeah.
We have to have it. It's like we feel that we have to have it to understand what went before. But what if that doesn't arrive? How do we tell that story? So to be in that symposium, which was about grief and what didn't happen for me, in a complicated event, you know, a day full of complicated stories and so many examples of different ways of experiencing grief, you know, it really troubles the conversation, as in it gave it that complexity and nuance that we do not often have space for because we don't get the happy ending. There is no final paragraph. And so I'm always looking for ways of explaining that, the feeling of being in the abyss and that amorphous feeling of boundarylessness, like that there is no boundary, that it's just an expansive experience, being alive, not having that concluding paragraph.
I think you could probably even go back 2 projects further to when you were doing the benches and the view and the wedding dresses, because it also shows that what I did still mattered. The experience that I had, although the struggle didn't have the expected resolution, there was still an ending. There wasn't in this case, a baby at the end of it, but you could draw the same parallels with stories about people who are successful in anything like business. For every one like unicorn story where they struggled and they lost everything and then they founded whatever big company, there are hundreds or thousands of people that struggle and struggle and struggle, and then they go back to their old job because it didn't work out. But we don't want to hear those stories.
We don't hear them. Oh, and that's so, you know, it's because it's not that it's this thing about the hero's journey, to go back to the books. You know, it's this thing that we have in storytelling that soothes us. It's a soothing way of understanding that there's a journey, and it's the hero's journey, the quest, and that, you know, that after the quest and the endurance, there will be a resolution. We can't comprehend the lack of resolution. It's too daunting. It's too boundarylessness. I lost my words, but it's too frightening to think that there is no ending. So we go back to 3-part structure with a conclusion that makes sense of what just happened. But what if there is no ending like that? And I think that's what I'm really interested in, or sort of kind of exploring that yearning. You know, it's that thing, I use the word yearning a lot because it's the conflict of we yearn for the happy ending. Of course we do, but you know, who gets it?
Yeah, exactly. Although I guess we're fed the story that will happen, but we're not really given the tools to cope with it if it doesn't.
No. And I think that's probably something, you know, to come back to sort of very early experience of losing my father. You know, I was confronted with that quite early on. I mean, I wasn't a child. Again, I suppose I sort of feel like, a bit like when I did the symposium, there are stories that are way sadder than mine. They're much more tragic, really, really deeply sort of awful things that happen. people. So I'm resistant to sort of saying, that it was a sort of a thing that happened that wasn't able to overcome or deal with. It was really sad. It was really, really sad. But it was also formative for understanding something about how things don't work out the way you want them to work out.
Yeah. I think that's probably why it's important that we don't compare one struggle to another struggle, because they're relative. And I think everybody deals with what they're going through with the tools that they have. And it doesn't take away or lessen how it felt just because something else is maybe observably worse. It's just what you went through at the time. You can only deal with it the way that you know how to in that moment. And comparing how you deal with something at 25 versus how you deal with something at 40 are two completely different things. The life experience, the emotional maturity, and the perspective that you have through having lived for longer, it's really hard to appreciate that. And I think as much as we all think we're grown up when we're 22 and 23, we're really not. But you don't know that until you're much older, and you can look back at your younger self and think, wow, how did I get through that? Or I had no idea what was going on, or how I even survived that. And would I be able to do that now? Or how would I approach it differently? Like, it's like you're effectively a different person at that age.
Yeah, completely different. And it's only by going through those transformations. They are transformations. You just don't want to do them at the time.
No.
They're some sort of endurance test that no one wants to do. And it's only when you're out the other side and have some distance. But there is a lot of resistance, sort of wish it's not happening, do all that kind of bargaining, wish it wasn't happening. But yeah, it is relative. And I just oscillate between sort of feeling like it's okay to be aware of its relative, and thinking, oh, it's just nowhere near as bad as what's happened to some people. Because I feel like, this thing of it's in my work. So I sort of I have to contextualize the fact that I make work about what I do, and I put it into the world with awareness for other people to make meaning from it. So it's not just for me, it's not for me, even though I'm making the work and I'm obviously changed by that work, but I'm making it for other people to make sense of what's happened to them, because I feel like that's the point of making the work. It's not that I make the work as a sort of gesture to something, like something good came out of this. It's not that. It's I'm an artist and that's what I do. I make work out of the thing that's happened. But that it has this meaning for somebody else to make meaning of their own loss and yearning, to make sense. And I sort of feel like that the language that I've gained over through being that in that experience, through being in the abyss, that I can translate that. It's like my body in relation to that becomes the material that I then translate into somebody else's experience. And there's the encounter that they have. And that's the thing that I think is really interesting, that there's this translation going on from what happened to me into somebody else's world. Because I'm not there to witness it, but that is what the work then does on its own. And so then it does have a bigger significance. This small thing that happened to me actually has a bigger significance. And it's like the benches. We all want to be remembered for being here, for being alive. I suppose it's my version of the plaque. It's like I'm making these plaques of my work. And, maybe I do feel that more acutely because I don't have children. I don't know. I can't comment because I haven't got them. It's like that thing it's a thing I haven't done. But, it's that thing of wanting to have made a mark while I was here in this place at this time. Why did I do it? And it's like, it's this connection. It's like to be connected. It really means something.
This has been really, really good, Jessa. It's been heavy and emotional and insightful and enlightening. And let's do this again, but we'll talk about
Should we talk about something?
We can talk about cameras
about some art?
and prints.
I feel like we should talk about next time maybe more, I don't know, embroidery, stitches.
I think
that you're
so.
interested in. We've not talked about any actual art.
Yeah.
I think we've just talked about life. But it's been so interesting. It's been so fascinating. And just thank you so much for inviting me to talk about it. I really mean that. I found this so wonderful. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Jessa Fairbrother. In the show notes, you can find links to her website and social media, as well as a journal article that was published in Tate Papers about her self-published book, Conversations with My Mother. Don't miss the latest episodes of Subtext and Discourse Artwood podcast by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. And if you think your friends or colleagues would enjoy the insights from my guests, then please feel free to forward them a link to the show. You're also welcome to send any comments, feedback, or questions about this or previous episodes of the program, whether through the contact form on my website or via social media. That's all for now. Thanks again for tuning in. My name's Michael Dooney, and you've been listening to Subtext and Discourse.